A prophet receives a vision so terrifying that it shakes the foundations of an entire nation. In the rose-red mountains of Edom, where cities are carved into impenetrable cliffs, a people believe they've built the perfect fortress. They soar like eagles, untouchable, invisible, eternal. But God has seen something they tried to hide, a crime so evil it demands divine vengeance. On the day Jerusalem burned, when innocent blood stained the streets and desperate families ran for their lives, Edom made a choice that would echo through eternity. They didn't just refuse to help their own brothers, they became the hunters. Now a mysterious prophet named Obadiah stands with a scroll containing only 21 verses, yet these words carry the weight of kingdoms rising and falling. He speaks of fire-consuming stubble, of mighty warriors paralyzed by supernatural terror, of hidden treasures dragged into the light, and of a day when the entire world will witness God's justice. The shortest book in the Bible is about to reveal the longest memory of God. Some sins are never forgotten. Something unusual was happening in the spiritual realm. A prophet was receiving a message, and this message was about a nation that thought it was safe from everything. The vision of Obadiah began with words that left no room for doubt. In verse 1 he declared, "We have heard a report from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent among the nations. Rise up, let us rise against her for battle." This wasn't just one prophet speaking. Notice how Obadiah said, "We have heard." The message was so powerful, so certain, that it united multiple voices. God himself had dispatched an ambassador to rally nations together. But who were they rising against? The answer was Edom, a kingdom built in one of the most incredible locations in the ancient world. Edom sat in the mountains south of the Dead Sea. Their cities weren't built on flat ground like other nations. They carved their homes directly into massive red sandstone cliffs. The capital, known as Sela and later called Petra, was hidden among towering rocks. To reach it, you had to walk through narrow passages where the stone walls rose so high they nearly touched overhead. In some places, only 2 or 3 people could walk side by side. This wasn't just impressive architecture, it was a military masterpiece. Any enemy trying to invade would have to enter through these tight corridors where Edomite soldiers could easily defend from above. Arrows, rocks, boiling oil, anything could rain down on attackers who had nowhere to hide and no room to maneuver. The city was a natural fortress that seemed designed by the earth itself to be unconquerable. The Edomites looked at their red rock walls and felt something dangerous growing in their hearts. They felt invincible. Every morning when they woke up and saw those towering cliffs surrounding them, they became more convinced that no army on earth could touch them. Their geographic advantage wasn't just a blessing, it was becoming their god. They trusted in their mountains more than anything else, and this trust was about to be challenged in a way they never imagined. The man delivering this message was named Obadiah. His name carried significant meaning in Hebrew. It meant servant of Yahweh or worshipper of the Lord. This wasn't coincidental. Names in the ancient world often reflected a person's character or calling, and Obadiah's name revealed everything about his mission. He wasn't speaking his own thoughts or sharing political opinions. He was delivering a message directly from God. What makes this prophecy remarkable is its size. The book of Obadiah contains only 21 verses, making it the shortest book in the entire Old Testament. You could read it aloud in just a few minutes, but don't let its brevity fool you. Sometimes the shortest messages carry the heaviest weight. A doctor doesn't need a long speech to deliver life-changing news. A judge doesn't need pages of explanation to pronounce a verdict. And God doesn't need thousands of words when his judgment is absolute and final. The timing of this prophecy was crucial, though scholars have debated exactly when Obadiah delivered it. What we know for certain is that it came during a period when Jerusalem had suffered greatly. The prophet was speaking into a moment of crisis, addressing crimes that had already been committed and pronouncing consequences that were now inevitable. In verse 1, Obadiah made it clear that his authority didn't come from human sources. He had received a report from the Lord. This phrase established the foundation for everything that followed. The prophet wasn't guessing about Edom's future or expressing personal grudges. He was transmitting divine revelation. When God speaks, his words don't return empty. They accomplish exactly what he intends. The message also revealed that God was already taking action. A messenger had been sent among the nations with a specific command: rise up for battle against Edom. This diplomatic mission was happening in the spiritual and political realms simultaneously. Nations were being moved into position like pieces on a game board, and they didn't even realize they were fulfilling divine prophecy. God was orchestrating events on a scale that no human could comprehend, and Edom had no idea what was coming. God now addressed Edom directly, and his words cut through their illusions like a sword through cloth. In verse 2, the Lord declared, "Behold, I will make you small among the nations, you shall be utterly despised." This was a stunning announcement. Edom wasn't small at the moment. They were influential, strategically located, and militarily strong. But God was speaking about their future as if it had already happened. In his eyes, their downfall was so certain it could be described in past tense. Then came the diagnosis of their real problem. Verse 3 revealed the disease eating away at Edom's soul. "The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, 'Who will bring me down to the ground?'" Here was the truth laid bare. Pride had become Edom's deceiver. Notice that God didn't say pride had merely influenced them or tempted them. He said it had deceived them. Deception means believing a lie so completely that you can't see the truth anymore. Edom's pride had blinded them to reality. What were they proud of? Their dwelling in the clefts of the rock. Every day they walked through their city, carved into stone, and every day they became more convinced of their own security. The high dwelling wasn't just a physical location, it had become a spiritual condition. They had elevated themselves in their own minds to a place where they thought even God couldn't reach them. The question they asked themselves revealed everything: who will bring me down to the ground? This wasn't a genuine question seeking an answer. It was a rhetorical declaration of their supposed invincibility. They believed the answer was no one, not the armies of Babylon, not the forces of Egypt, not the warriors of any nation on earth. Their fortress had become their false god, and they worshipped it every time they looked at those imposing cliffs. But pride always deceives in the same way. It takes something real, in this case genuine geographic advantage, and twists it into something false. Yes, Edom's city was difficult to attack. Yes, their position provided natural protection. But pride convinced them that difficult meant impossible and that natural protection meant absolute security. They had crossed the line from reasonable confidence into dangerous delusion. God saw through it all. He understood that their pride wasn't just an attitude problem. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. They had forgotten that they were creatures, not the Creator. They had forgotten that every stone in their cliffs had been shaped by the same God, who could just as easily remove those stones or remove them from those stones. Their entire sense of security rested on forgetting who was really in control. God responded to Edom's arrogant question with words that shattered their illusions completely. In verse 4, he declared, "Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though you make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord." The eagle imagery was perfect for Edom's situation. Eagles build their nests in the highest, most inaccessible places they can find. Cliff faces, mountain peaks, places where predators cannot reach and where the eagle can survey everything below. In the ancient world, the eagle represented the ultimate in altitude and security. If you wanted to describe something unreachably high, you compared it to an eagle's nest. But God didn't stop with the eagle. He pushed the metaphor even further. Though you make your nest among the stars. The stars represented the absolute limit of height in ancient thinking. They were the unreachable ceiling of creation, the lights God had placed in the heavens that no human hand could touch. By saying this, God was addressing not just Edom's current position, but the absolute maximum of any possible security measure they could imagine. The message was devastatingly clear. Height doesn't matter. No matter how high you climb, no matter how unreachable you make yourself, God's reach extends beyond all of it. If you could somehow build a nest on the stars themselves, God could still bring you down from there. There is no elevation that puts you beyond His authority, no fortress that stands outside His jurisdiction, no hiding place that escapes His notice. This wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. God wasn't saying He might bring them down, or that He was considering it. He said, "I will bring you down with absolute certainty." And He signed this promise with His own name, declares the Lord. When God declares something, it becomes as certain as something that has already happened. For Edom, this meant their entire security system was built on sand. Every stone they had carved, every defensive position they had established, every military strategy they had developed, all of it was worthless before God. Their mountain fortress was no more protective than a tent in an open field when God decided to act. The cliffs that seemed so permanent were as temporary as morning mist. The stones that seemed so solid were as fragile as clay pots in the hands of their maker. God now painted a picture of what Edom's destruction would look like, and He did it by comparing it to things that usually leave something behind. In verse 5, He asked, "If thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, how you have been destroyed? Would they not steal only enough for themselves? If grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave gleanings?" These comparisons were brilliant because they highlighted how complete Edom's destruction would be. Think about thieves for a moment. When thieves break into a house, they don't take everything. They take the valuable items they can carry: jewelry, money, small electronics. They leave furniture, dishes, clothes, most books. Why? Because they can't carry everything. They don't want everything. And taking too much increases their risk of being caught. Now think about grape harvesters working in a vineyard. In ancient Israel, the law actually required farmers to leave some grapes on the vine after harvest. These gleanings were left for the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners who needed food. It was a system of built-in generosity. Even when harvesters tried to be thorough, they deliberately left something behind. But Edom's plundering would be different. Verse 6 revealed the devastating reality, how Esau has been pillaged, his treasures sought out. Notice the name change here. God called them Esau, not Edom. He was reaching back to their ancestor, the man who sold his birthright for a bowl of soup, the man who despised his inheritance. That same spirit of short-sighted foolishness lived on in his descendants. The phrase, "treasures sought out," meant that nothing hidden would stay hidden. Edom had accumulated wealth over centuries. They had secret storage rooms carved deep in the rock. They had hidden chambers where they kept their most valuable possessions. They thought these hiding places were secure because they were so cleverly concealed. But God promised that every treasure would be found, every hiding place would be discovered, every secret chamber would be opened. This completeness of destruction revealed something important. When humans conquer other humans, they work within human limitations. They get tired, they miss things, they can't search everywhere. But when God brings judgment, He works without limitations. Nothing escapes His notice. No hiding place is too clever, no secret is too well kept. For Edom, this meant total loss. The wealth they had accumulated through trade and commerce, gone. The treasures they had stored for future generations, taken. The secret reserves they had hidden for emergencies, discovered and emptied. Everything they had worked for, everything they had saved, everything they had protected, all of it would be stripped away. They would be left with absolutely nothing, proving that their destruction came not from human enemies, but from divine judgment. The prophecy took an even darker turn. It wasn't enough that Edom would be destroyed. The method of their destruction would be particularly painful. Verse 7 revealed, "All your allies have driven you to your border. Those at peace with you have deceived you. They have prevailed against you. Those who eat your bread have set a trap beneath you. You have no understanding." Edom had allies. They had treaties with other nations, agreements of mutual protection and support. They had diplomatic relationships that they believed would protect them in times of crisis. Some of these allies were close enough to share meals with Edom's leaders, and in the ancient world, eating bread together was a sacred act of fellowship and trust. It created an obligation of loyalty that wasn't supposed to be broken. But all of these allies would turn against Edom. The men who had made peace treaties would practice deception instead. Those who had promised protection would become attackers. The friends who had shared bread would set traps. This wasn't just military defeat, it was personal betrayal of the deepest kind. The phrase, "driven you to your border," suggested that Edom would be pushed completely out of their own territory. Their allies wouldn't just refuse to help, they would actively participate in forcing Edom from their land. The ones they trusted would become the instruments of their exile. Even more painful was the deception involved. These allies would pretend friendship while planning betrayal. They would smile to Edom's face while sharpening knives behind their backs. They would speak words of peace while preparing for war. Edom would believe they had friends right up until the moment those friends became enemies. The trap beneath you suggested something hidden and unexpected. Just as Edom had hidden their treasures in secret places, so their enemies would hide their true intentions until the perfect moment to strike. The ones who sat at Edom's tables, who walked in Edom's streets, who shared Edom's confidence, these would be the ones to spring the trap when Edom was most vulnerable. The final phrase cut deepest: "You have no understanding." Despite their reputation for wisdom, despite their famous counselors, despite their strategic thinking, Edom would completely fail to see this betrayal coming. Their discernment would fail them at the most critical moment. They would be blindsided by the very people they trusted most. This failure of understanding wasn't just about missing political signs. It was about a fundamental blindness that came from their pride and self-deception. God wasn't finished describing what would happen to Edom. Now he targeted something they were famous for throughout the region: their wisdom. Verse 8 announced, "Will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy the wise men out of Edom and understanding out of Mount Esau?" Edom had a long-standing reputation for producing wise men and counselors. Their thinkers were respected in royal courts across the region. In the book of Job, one of Job's 3 friends was Eliphaz the Temanite, a man from Teman, one of Edom's principal cities. His presence in that ancient wisdom dialogue showed how seriously Edom's intellectual tradition was regarded. Kings sought advice from Edomite counselors. Merchants consulted Edomite advisors about trade routes and business decisions. Their wisdom wasn't just philosophical, it was practical, tested and proven effective over generations. This reputation gave Edom another layer of confidence. Even if their military failed, even if their fortress was breached, they believed their wisdom would help them navigate through crisis. But God promised to destroy all of it. The wise men would be removed. Understanding would be eliminated from Mount Esau. Notice the phrase, "on that day." This wasn't a gradual decline of intellectual capacity over generations. It was an immediate, devastating removal of wisdom at the exact moment when they would need it most. Think about what this meant practically. When the crisis came, when their allies turned against them, when their defenses were breached, that's precisely when they would need clear thinking. That's when they would need strategic planning, clever solutions, diplomatic skill. That's when their famous wisdom should have shone brightest. But instead, it would vanish exactly when it was most necessary. This judgment revealed something profound about the limits of human wisdom. All of Edom's celebrated thinkers, all their accumulated knowledge, all their strategic expertise, none of it could function apart from God's blessing. When he withdrew his favor, their wisdom became foolishness. Their understanding became confusion. Their clarity became blindness. The question, "Will I not on that day?" wasn't really asking for an answer. It was emphasizing the certainty of what God would do. He was declaring his intention with a rhetorical question that demanded agreement. Yes, God would absolutely destroy their wisdom. Yes, he would definitely remove their understanding. And he would do it at the precise moment when they needed these things most, proving that these gifts had always come from him in the first place. The final element of Edom's collapse involved their military might. Verse 9 declared, "And your mighty men shall be dismayed, O Teman, so that every man from Mount Esau will be cut off by slaughter." Teman was more than just a city in Edom. It was synonymous with Edomite military power. The warriors of Teman were legendary fighters, trained from youth, experienced in battle, feared by their enemies. They were the backbone of Edom's defense system, the elite force that made invasion seem impossible. If any group could be counted on to stand firm in crisis, it was these mighty men of Teman. But God promised they would be dismayed. This word meant more than just scared. It described a deep terror that paralyzes, a fear so overwhelming that it destroys the ability to function. These hardened warriors, who had faced death many times, would be reduced to trembling, ineffective men. Their courage would evaporate. Their training would be forgotten. Their weapons would fall from shaking hands. This wasn't cowardice in the normal sense. God himself was going to send this dismay upon them. It would be a supernatural terror, a divine crushing of their spirits that made defense impossible. The same men who had once inspired fear in others would themselves be consumed by uncontrollable fear. The purpose of this fear was made explicit. "So that every man from Mount Esau will be cut off by slaughter." The paralysis of their military force ensured that the coming destruction would be complete. Without effective defense, without warriors able to fight back, the slaughter would proceed unopposed. Every man, not some men, not most men, but every man would be cut off. This totality was important. God wasn't talking about a military defeat where some soldiers died and others retreated. He wasn't describing a battle with casualties on both sides. He was announcing complete annihilation. The phrase "cut off" meant eliminated, removed from existence, erased. There would be no survivors to rebuild, no remnant to carry on, no hope of recovery. The systematic dismantling was now complete. God had promised to remove Edom's geographic security, their wisdom, their alliances, their wealth, and finally their military strength. Every possible defense mechanism had been identified and targeted. Every source of confidence had been exposed as futile. Every reason for pride had been demolished. Edom stood naked before divine judgment, with absolutely nothing left to protect them. Now God revealed why he was bringing such complete judgment against Edom. The reason wasn't arbitrary or random. There was a specific crime that demanded this response, and it began with a relationship that should have been sacred. Verse 10 stated the charge directly. "Because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever." The word brother changed everything. This wasn't just one nation attacking another nation. This wasn't a typical conflict between neighboring kingdoms competing for resources or territory. This was family turning against family. Edom descended from Esau, and Israel descended from Jacob, and Esau and Jacob were twin brothers, born to Isaac and Rebekah on the same day. That family connection should have created an unbreakable bond. In the ancient world, family loyalty was sacred. You protected your relatives even when it cost you something. You stood with your brothers even in difficult situations. The ties of blood created obligations that everyone understood and respected. To betray family was to violate one of the most fundamental rules of civilization. But Edom had committed violence against Jacob. The Hebrew word for violence here carried heavy meaning. It meant harm done through brutality and cruelty, not just accidental injury. This was deliberate, malicious harm inflicted on a brother who should have been protected. The violence wasn't just physical attacks. It included everything Edom had done to hurt, damage, and destroy their relatives in Israel. God's response to this betrayal was absolute. Shame would cover them. Not just temporary embarrassment, but lasting disgrace that would define their memory forever, and they would be cut off forever. There was no possibility of reconciliation here, no chance for restoration, no hope of recovery. The judgment was permanent and final because the crime struck at something God held sacred, the duty of brothers to protect each other. The phrase, "your brother Jacob," emphasized the personal nature of this sin. God didn't let Edom hide behind political language or national interests. He forced them to face what they had really done. They had attacked their own brother. Every act of violence against Israel was an act of violence against family. Every moment of cruelty was a betrayal of blood ties, and God had witnessed all of it. God now began to detail exactly what Edom had done, taking them back to a specific moment in history when everything went wrong. Verse 11 painted the scene. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. There was a day when disaster struck Jerusalem. Foreign armies invaded the holy city. Strangers, people with no connection to Israel, no history with God's people, walked through Jerusalem's streets taking whatever they wanted. The wealth that had been accumulated over generations was carried away by hands that had no right to it. Foreigners who had never worshipped in the temple entered through gates that were supposed to protect God's city. The phrase "cast lots for Jerusalem" revealed how complete the conquest was. Casting lots was how they divided the spoils of war. The soldiers threw dice or drew straws to determine who got which portion of the plunder. Jerusalem itself had become a prize to be divided among invaders, a possession to be parceled out like merchandise. And where was Edom during all of this? They stood aloof. That phrase captured their cold indifference perfectly. They stood at a distance, watching but not helping. They saw their brothers being attacked, but made no move to intervene. They witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, but remained passive observers, as if what was happening had nothing to do with them. But their passive stance was actually an active choice. Standing aloof meant deliberately choosing not to get involved. It meant seeing a need and turning away. It meant having the power to help, but refusing to use it. In a situation where you have to choose sides, refusing to choose is itself a choice, and Edom chose wrong. God's assessment was brutal. You were like one of them. By standing aside, Edom became morally equivalent to the invaders. Their refusal to help made them accomplices to the crime. They might not have wielded the swords themselves, but their passive observation enabled the violence to continue unopposed. In God's eyes, the brother who watches his sibling being beaten without lifting a finger to help is just as guilty as the ones throwing the punches. This revealed an important truth about responsibility. Sometimes sin isn't about what you do, it's about what you refuse to do. Edom's crime wasn't primarily one of action, but of inaction. They sinned by standing still when they should have moved, by watching when they should have fought, by remaining neutral when family loyalty demanded they take a side. Edom's sin went beyond mere passivity. They didn't just fail to help, they took pleasure in watching their brother suffer. God addressed this directly in verse 12, using repetition to emphasize how seriously he viewed their behavior. But do not gloat over the day of your brother in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of distress. 3 times God said, "Do not," and each time he specified a different aspect of Edom's cruel response. First, they gloated. To gloat means to look at someone else's suffering with satisfaction and pleasure. It's taking joy in another person's pain. When Jerusalem fell, when families were torn apart, when blood ran in the streets, Edom smiled. They felt good about what they saw. Their brother's agony brought them happiness. Second, they rejoiced. This was active celebration, not just quiet satisfaction. They didn't hide their pleasure. They expressed it openly. While Judah was experiencing the worst day of their national existence, while mothers were screaming for their children and men were dying in the streets, Edom was having a party. The day of ruin for Judah was a day of celebration for Edom. Third, they boasted. They spoke proud words, probably mocking Judah's helplessness and celebrating their own safety. "Look at mighty Jerusalem now," they might have said. "Where is their God who was supposed to protect them? We told you our fortress was better than theirs." Their words added insult to injury, rubbing salt in wounds that were already bleeding. The repetition of "the day" in this verse was significant. God was pointing to a specific historical moment, not a vague period of time, but an actual day when disaster struck. On that particular day, when help was most needed, when compassion was most appropriate, when family loyalty should have been strongest, that's when Edom chose to gloat, rejoice, and boast. What made this even worse was the relationship involved. These weren't strangers celebrating an enemy's defeat. This was your brother and the people of Judah, family members who shared ancestry, history, and blood. The gloating wasn't just cruel, it was a perversion of family bonds. It revealed that somewhere deep in Edom's heart, they had stopped seeing Israel as brothers and had started seeing them as competitors or even enemies. This kind of rejoicing in another's suffering revealed a darkness in Edom's soul. It showed that their pride hadn't just made them confident in their own security, it had made them hateful toward others. They had become the kind of people who find pleasure in watching others fall, who feel elevated when others are brought low, who celebrate tragedy when it happens to someone else. God continued his detailed account of Edom's crimes, and now the accusations became even more serious. Verse 13 added 3 more charges, again using the phrase "do not" repeatedly. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth in the day of his calamity. Notice that phrase, "the gate of my people." God claimed Israel as his own. When Edom violated Israel, they weren't just attacking another nation, they were attacking God's chosen people. The gates represented entry points into the city, places of authority and control. For Edom to enter these gates meant they were crossing boundaries they had no right to cross. But they did enter. On the day of calamity, the same terrible day when Jerusalem fell, Edom didn't just watch from a distance anymore. They came close. They walked through the gates. They entered the city that lay broken and vulnerable. This was a violation of what little remained of Jerusalem's dignity and security. Once inside, they gloated again. God mentioned this twice in his charges because it was so offensive to him. Even seeing their brother's disaster up close didn't soften their hearts. Walking through the ruins, seeing the destruction with their own eyes, witnessing the human cost of the invasion, None of it moved them to compassion. Instead, they looked down on the affliction with pleasure and satisfaction. The word disaster here meant complete ruin and devastation. This wasn't minor damage or temporary setback. This was catastrophic destruction that left people with nothing. Homes were destroyed, families were shattered, lives were ended, and Edom stood in the middle of it all, not mourning but gloating. Then came the worst part: do not loot his wealth. Edom reached out their hands and took things that didn't belong to them. They stole from people who had already lost everything. They grabbed wealth from the ruins, picking through the debris like scavengers looking for anything valuable. This transformed them from passive observers into active participants in the plunder. By taking wealth on the day of calamity, Edom showed their true character. They weren't there to help. They weren't there to offer aid or comfort. They were there to profit from their brothers' suffering. They saw Jerusalem's fall as an opportunity to enrich themselves. Other people's tragedy became their windfall. The repetition of "in the day of his calamity" 3 times in one verse hammered home the timing of these crimes. This all happened on the same day, the worst possible day, when help was needed most, when human decency demanded compassion. That's when Edom chose to enter the gates, gloat over disaster, and steal wealth. Their timing made their crimes even more heinous. The accusations grew darker still. Edom's crimes weren't finished with entering gates and stealing wealth. Verse 14 revealed something far more sinister. Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress. Picture what this meant in practical terms. Jerusalem had fallen. The city was burning. Foreign soldiers were killing people in the streets. In this chaos, some people managed to escape. They ran from their homes, leaving everything behind, concerned only with surviving. Families fled through whatever exits they could find, heading south toward the wilderness, hoping to get far enough away to be safe. But Edom was waiting for them. The crossroads were strategic points where roads met, places where refugees would naturally pass as they fled. These were mountain passes, intersections of trade routes, choke points where the terrain forced people through narrow areas. Edom positioned their forces at these locations deliberately and intentionally. They weren't there to help the refugees. They weren't there to offer safe passage or temporary shelter. They were there to cut them off, to stop them, to catch them, to end their escape. The phrase "cut off" meant to kill, to eliminate, to destroy. Edom was hunting down survivors who had already been through unimaginable trauma. Think about who these fugitives were. They were families with small children, old people who could barely walk, injured men trying to get to safety, mothers carrying babies. They were unarmed civilians running for their lives. They posed no military threat to anyone. They were simply trying to survive, and Edom killed them. At the crossroads, when these desperate people thought they might finally be safe, when they believed they had escaped the worst, that's when Edom struck. The refugees who had survived the initial attack, who had made it out of the burning city, who had fled through dangerous territory, they were cut down by people who were supposed to be their relatives. This wasn't combat. This wasn't war between soldiers. This was murder of the helpless. It was the systematic hunting and killing of refugees who had no way to defend themselves. The crossroads became killing fields where families died together, where the wounded were finished off, where hope died along with the people who carried it. The cruelty of this act was staggering. Edom didn't even have the excuse of being caught up in the heat of battle. They had time to plan this. They had to position their forces at the crossroads in advance. They had to organize a systematic effort to intercept refugees. Every death at these crossroads was premeditated and deliberate. If blocking escape routes wasn't evil enough, Edom found another way to ensure their brother's destruction. The second half of verse 14 added another charge. They were not to hand over his survivors in the day of distress. But the fact that God had to forbid this meant Edom had done it. Some refugees managed to get past Edom's forces at the crossroads. They evaded the ambushes, escaped the killing zones, and kept running. They must have felt incredible relief when they slipped through, believing they had finally made it to safety. But their relief was premature. Edom captured these survivors and delivered them back to the enemy. The people who had risked everything to escape, who had watched their families die, who had fled through blood and fire, Edom handed them over to the very army they were running from. This was betrayal at its most calculated and cruel. Think about what this meant for the survivors. They had escaped Jerusalem. They had made it past the crossroads. They were free, and then Edom caught them and dragged them back to face execution or slavery. The horror of being captured by people who were supposed to be family, only to be delivered to foreign soldiers, it was almost unimaginable cruelty. This act revealed that Edom wasn't just passively allowing Israel's destruction. They were actively ensuring it was as complete as possible. They were working to make sure no one survived, no one escaped, no one lived to rebuild. They had become agents of genocide against their own relatives. The phrase, "in the day of distress," appeared again, emphasizing the timing. This was the worst possible moment to commit such acts. When people are in distress, that's when they need help most desperately. That's when human decency demands we extend aid, not add to suffering. But Edom chose the day of maximum distress to inflict maximum harm. By handing over survivors, Edom became fully complicit in whatever happened to those people afterward. If they were executed, Edom had blood on their hands. If they were enslaved, Edom had participated in their enslavement. If they were tortured, Edom had enabled their torture. There was no way to claim innocence when you actively deliver victims to their oppressors. Having detailed Edom's specific crimes, God now placed everything in a larger context. Verse 15 declared, "For the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head." The day of the Lord was a phrase heavy with meaning in prophetic literature. It referred to a time when God would intervene directly in human history to execute judgment and establish justice. This wasn't just about Edom anymore. It was about all nations facing divine accountability. Every kingdom, every empire, every people group would stand before God and answer for their actions. And this day was near. Not distant, not in some far-off future, but close at hand. The judgment was coming soon, and nations needed to prepare themselves. For Edom, this nearness meant their time was running out. The crimes they had committed would be answered quickly. Then came one of the most important principles in all of Scripture. As you have done, it shall be done to you. This was perfect justice, receiving back exactly what you gave out. Edom had shown no mercy, so they would receive no mercy. They had betrayed family, so they would be betrayed. They had killed refugees, so their own people would be killed. They had stolen wealth, so their wealth would be stolen. Every crime would be answered with proportional punishment. The phrase, "your deeds shall return on your own head," meant that consequences wouldn't land on someone else. Edom couldn't blame circumstances or other nations. The judgment falling on them would be directly connected to their own actions. They were creating their own future with every cruel choice they made. This principle of reciprocal justice ran throughout the prophecy. Edom had stood at crossroads to kill fugitives, so their allies would turn against them at their borders. Edom had entered Jerusalem's gates to loot, so their own treasures would be completely pillaged. Edom had rejoiced at their brother's fall, so they would experience shame and destruction. Every detail of their punishment mirrored their crimes. The universality of this coming judgment was important. God wasn't being unfair by singling out Edom. Every nation would face the same standard. Every people group would be judged by the same principles. The day of the Lord would bring justice to the entire world, holding everyone accountable for how they had treated others. especially how the strong had treated the weak and how families had treated each other. God concluded his charges against the nations with powerful imagery. Verse 16 declared, "For as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so all the nations shall drink continually. They shall drink and swallow, and shall be as though they had never been." The reference to drinking on God's holy mountain took the reader back to Jerusalem's fall. When foreign armies conquered the city, they celebrated on Mount Zion itself, God's holy place. They drank wine in victory celebration, probably using vessels stolen from the temple. They partied on sacred ground, treating God's mountain like their personal conquest. This drinking represented their triumph and pleasure in victory. They toasted their success, celebrated their power, enjoyed the fruits of their conquest. They drank deeply, savoring every moment of their victory over God's people. For them, it was a moment of supreme satisfaction and joy. But now, God promised they would drink something different. All the nations, not just Edom, but everyone who had participated in Jerusalem's destruction, would drink from God's cup. And this wasn't the wine of celebration. This was the cup of divine wrath and judgment. They had drunk in joy. Now they would drink in agony. The phrase "drink continually" meant this judgment wouldn't be brief or merciful. They wouldn't just take one sip and be done. They would drink and keep drinking, cup after cup of God's fury. The judgment would continue until it accomplished its complete purpose. There would be no early release, no reduction of sentence, no mercy for good behavior. Then came the most chilling phrase, "They shall drink and swallow, and shall be as though they had never been." This described complete annihilation, total erasure from existence. They wouldn't just be defeated, they would be eliminated so thoroughly that it would be as if they had never existed in the first place. Think about what that means. No ruins to mark where their cities stood, no descendants to carry on their names, no cultural legacy for future generations to study, no memory preserved in history books. They would drink God's judgment until they were completely consumed, leaving nothing behind to show they had ever lived. This was the ultimate reversal. They had celebrated on God's mountain, thinking they had won. They had drunk victory wine, believing they were the conquerors. But their drinking was just the beginning. Now they would drink a cup they couldn't refuse, from hands they couldn't resist, until they vanished completely from the earth. The party on Mount Zion would end in complete destruction, and the nations that drank there would discover too late that their celebration had been premature. After all the judgment and destruction, the prophecy shifted dramatically. Hope entered the picture where there had been only darkness. Verse 17 announced something completely different. "But in Mount Zion there shall be those who escape, and it shall be holy, and the house of Jacob shall possess their own possessions." Mount Zion, the same mountain where enemies had celebrated with drinking and mockery, would become a place of escape. While other nations faced complete destruction, while Edom would be erased as though they had never existed, survivors would remain on God's holy mountain. These weren't just random people who got lucky. They were specifically preserved by God's intention and power. The phrase, "those who escape," meant a remnant, a group that survived when survival seemed impossible. During Jerusalem's darkest hour, when death surrounded the city on every side, some would make it through, not because they were stronger or smarter, but because God had designated Mount Zion as their refuge. The mountain that enemies violated would become the mountain that protected God's people. Then came a crucial declaration, "And it shall be holy." Mount Zion would be cleansed from the defilement that foreign armies had brought. The sacred character of the place would be restored. What had been profaned would become pure again. God would reclaim his mountain and set it apart once more for his purposes. No trace of the enemy's celebration would remain. The holiness would return. The final promise in this verse was equally important. The house of Jacob shall possess their own possessions. Everything that had been taken would be given back. The wealth that strangers carried away, the land that foreigners claimed, the inheritance that seemed lost forever, all of it would return to its rightful owners. Jacob's descendants would once again own what belonged to them. This wasn't just about physical property. It was about restoration of identity and dignity. When you lose your possessions, you lose part of who you are. When everything is taken from you, you feel like you have nothing left. But God promised to reverse this completely. Israel would possess again, own again, control again what was theirs by right. The restoration didn't stop with survival and recovery. God promised something more, transformation into power. Verse 18 revealed, "The house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau stubble. They shall burn them and consume them, and there shall be no survivor for the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken." This was a complete reversal of roles. Jacob and Joseph, representing Israel, would become fire and flame. These weren't defensive images. Fire doesn't just protect itself, it actively consumes what's around it. Flame doesn't just survive, it destroys. God was promising that Israel would be transformed from victims into agents of judgment. Esau, on the other hand, would become stubble. Stubble was the leftover stalks of grain after harvest. Dry, brittle, worthless material that farmers would burn to clear their fields. It had no strength, no resistance, no value. When fire touched stubble, the stubble didn't stand a chance. It would ignite immediately and burn completely. The prophecy was explicit about what would happen. They shall burn them and consume them. This wasn't partial destruction or temporary defeat. The fire would burn until nothing remained. The consumption would be total and complete. Edom wouldn't just lose a battle or suffer setbacks. They would be utterly destroyed by the very people they had once oppressed. The phrase, "There shall be no survivor for the house of Esau," left no room for hope or recovery. Not a single person from Edom would remain. Their complete elimination would prove that this judgment came from God, not just from human warfare. When humans fight humans, there are always some survivors, some prisoners, some escapees. But when God executes judgment, he can ensure absolute completeness. The verse ended with the ultimate authority, "For the Lord has spoken." These weren't predictions based on human wisdom or military analysis. This was divine decree. When God speaks something into existence, it happens exactly as he said. His word carries creative and destructive power that cannot be resisted or reversed. The restoration included specific territorial promises that showed how comprehensive God's plans were. Verse 19 began mapping out the new boundaries. "Those of the Negeb shall possess Mount Esau, and those of the Shephelah shall possess the land of the Philistines." The Negeb was Israel's southern desert region, a harsh landscape that required tough people to survive there. These inhabitants would expand their territory to include Mount Esau, Edom's homeland, the very mountains where Edom had felt so secure. The rocky cliffs that seemed unconquerable would become Israel's possession. The fortress that pride had built would belong to those Edom had despised. This expansion southward meant Israel would control trade routes that Edom had dominated for centuries. The strategic advantage would shift completely. Everything Edom had used to enrich themselves would now benefit Israel instead. The tables would turn so completely that the oppressed would possess the oppressor's land. The Shephelah was the region of low hills between Israel's mountains and the Mediterranean coast. The people there would possess the land of the Philistines, Israel's ancient enemies to the west. The Philistines had fought against Israel for generations, controlling the coastal plain and threatening Israel's security. But now that land would belong to Israel. These weren't random territorial gains. Each expansion represented the reversal of a historical wound. The Philistines had been thorns in Israel's side since the days of the judges. Edom had betrayed Israel in their moment of need. Now both of these enemy territories would become Israel's inheritance. Every direction of expansion told a story of justice and restoration. The territorial promises continued, moving northward. The second half of verse 19 declared, "They shall possess the land of Ephraim and the land of Samaria, and Benjamin shall possess Gilead." Ephraim and Samaria represented the northern kingdom of Israel, which had been destroyed by Assyria over a century before Judah fell to Babylon. These territories had been lost, settled by foreigners, and seemed gone forever. But God promised they would be possessed again. The division between north and south would end. The scattered people would become one nation again. This wasn't just about land acquisition. It was about reunification of families that had been torn apart by war and exile. Brothers would be together again. The northern tribes and southern tribes would share one inheritance. The split that had weakened Israel for generations would be healed. Benjamin was the smallest tribe, given territory between Judah and the northern tribes. They would possess Gilead, the fertile highlands east of the Jordan River. Gilead was valuable territory, known for its balm, its pastures, and its strategic importance. For little Benjamin to possess this significant region showed that God's restoration wouldn't follow human expectations of who deserved what. These promises addressed something deeper than just territory. They spoke to the pain of losing ancestral lands, of watching your heritage slip away, of feeling like your people would never recover what was lost. God was saying that nothing was too far gone to be restored, no loss too complete to be reversed, no exile too permanent to be ended. Verse 20 added more detail about who would possess these lands. The exiles of this host of the people of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad shall possess the cities of the Negeb. The exiles, those who had been forcibly removed from their homeland, would return. But they wouldn't return weak and humble, grateful just to come home. They would return as conquerors and possessors. The host of Israel would take territory that extended to Zarephath, a Phoenician city on the Mediterranean coast north of Israel. This meant expansion beyond Israel's traditional northern boundary. Then came a reference to exiles in Sepharad. Scholars debate exactly where Sepharad was located. Some suggest it was Sardis in Asia Minor. Others point to locations in Media or elsewhere. What mattered wasn't the exact location, but what it represented. A distant place of exile, far from home, seemingly too far away to ever return. Yet even these distant exiles would come back. And when they returned, they would possess cities in the Negeb, the southern region, from the far north to the deep south, from distant exile to full possession. God's restoration would span every direction and include every scattered person. No one would be forgotten. No exile was too far away to be brought home. The specificity of these promises mattered. God wasn't making vague statements about things getting better someday. He was naming specific regions, identifying particular groups of exiles, describing concrete territorial expansions. These details gave people something to hold on to, something to believe in during dark times. The prophecy built toward its climax with a stunning promise in verse 21. Saviors shall go up to Mount Zion to rule Mount Esau. Notice the plural. Not one savior, but multiple saviors. These would be deliverers raised up by God to lead his people and execute his justice. They would ascend Mount Zion, the holy mountain, taking their authority from God's presence there. Their legitimacy would come from the Lord, not from their own power or achievement. These saviors would rule Mount Esau. The very mountain where Edom had felt so proud and secure would come under Israel's authority. The fortress would be governed from Zion. This represented complete reversal of power dynamics. The oppressed would rule over the territory of the oppressors. Those who had been victims would become judges. The word rule here carried the sense of judging and governing. These deliverers wouldn't just occupy Edom's territory, they would establish justice there, implement righteous governance, and ensure that what happened to Israel would never happen to anyone else. They would rule with the authority and wisdom that came from God. This promise answered a deep human need for justice. When you've been wronged, when you've suffered unjustly, part of what you need is to see justice established. Not revenge for its own sake, but the setting right of what went wrong. These saviors on Mount Zion would represent God's justice being enacted in history, His righteousness being established in the real world where real people had suffered real harm. The final phrase of verse 21 lifted everything to another level entirely. And the kingdom shall be the Lord's. This was the ultimate point of everything that had been said. All the judgment against Edom, all the promises to Israel, all the territorial expansions and returns from exile, they all served this greater purpose. The kingdom would belong to the Lord, not to Israel, not to any human ruler, not to any earthly power, to God alone. This declaration meant that God's sovereignty would be recognized universally. Every nation would acknowledge His rule. Every kingdom would bow to His authority. Every people would understand that He alone was the true king. Human kingdoms would be revealed as temporary shadows of the eternal kingdom that belonged to God. The restoration of Israel wasn't just about one nation getting their land back. It was about demonstrating God's character to the world. His faithfulness, His justice, His power, His mercy. Through Israel's restoration, the nations would see that God keeps His promises, rights wrongs, and establishes His rule in spite of every opposition. Mount Zion would become the center of this kingdom, but the kingdom itself would extend to all creation. What began with promises to Abraham about one family would culminate in God's rule over all families, all nations, all peoples. The particular would serve the universal. The restoration of Jacob would reveal the kingship of God. The book closed with this declaration of God's universal kingdom, and in doing so, it vindicated everything about God's character. His justice had been questioned when Jerusalem fell. People wondered where God was when His people suffered. They asked why He allowed the wicked to triumph. They doubted whether He truly cared about right and wrong. Obadiah's prophecy answered all these questions. God had seen everything. He had recorded every crime. He had noted every act of cruelty. Nothing escaped His attention. And He would respond with perfect justice, not too harsh, not too lenient, but exactly appropriate to what had been done. Edom would be destroyed completely because their betrayal of brotherhood was a capital offense in God's eyes. Israel would be restored completely because God's promises were unbreakable. Other nations would face judgment because their actions had real consequences. And through it all, God's kingdom would be established because that was always His plan from the beginning. The brevity of the book made its message even more powerful. In just 21 verses, God laid out the complete arc of judgment and restoration. Pride would fall, betrayal would be punished, the suffering would be vindicated, the scattered would be gathered, the weak would become strong, and God's rule would be acknowledged by all. If this journey through Obadiah has opened your eyes to something you'd never seen before, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button so you won't miss our next deep dive into Scripture. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that God sees everything, remembers everything, and will make everything right in the end. And leave a comment telling us what struck you most about this powerful prophecy. The book of Obadiah reminds us that the kingdom belongs to the Lord and that truth changes everything.